So yeah, just in terms of an overview of today's session, I'll give a little bit of background about ACE and who we are and the programme. I've given some background, I think, on the emails that I've kind of been sending out, but yet an opportunity just to go over that again. And then I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, Dr. Tom Harrison and ACE Chair Gary Lewis, to deliver the body of the training. And then we're going to finish up with a Q&A at the end. If you do have any questions or things are coming to you throughout the training, just pop any questions that you've got in the chat function and we'll cover those at the end. Okay, so in terms of ACE, the Association for Character Education, like who are we and what do we do? So basically we support a community of schools who are all working towards their kind of character provision. And what we do is we support them to take a whole school approach to the development of character in their pupils so they can flourish in life. We do this through three main ways. Predominantly we do it through really recognising outstanding practice. So we're this network of schools predominantly in England. We've got some in Scotland and then we do have some overseas as well. And what we do is we really look to recognise and acknowledge outstanding practice, which we do through our kite marks. So we've got a couple of kite marks, School of Character and School of Character Kite Mark Plus, which do have a lot of integrity and value attached to them. We have a kind of a very high standard, so they do represent very high levels of quality in terms of how character is delivered within those institutions and those schools. And then what we also do is we're very much about trying to enable and capacity build schools as well, which we do through CPD. But one of our big things is around sharing what works across our network of schools, ultimately, which we do through conferences and webinars and training and newsletters and interviews and things like that. We really find that schools really like to hear from schools. So in terms of the programme in Scotland that we're looking to run, a bit of background really on this. ACE merged with a charity called Character Scotland, which some of you may know from the Inspiring Purpose programme that they've delivered within schools for I think about the last 10 years. And we came together with that charity towards the end of last year because we thought we could have a much bigger impact if we came together. So what we're really hoping is that, you know, this series of 4 CPD sessions that we've got outlined will be really beneficial to you as schools. But what we're also hoping is that maybe it'll be the start of the development of a community of schools of character within Scotland, ultimately, and that, you know, we'll start off with a core of beacons of best practice and schools who are, you know, really leading the way in character and values as you already are, and hopefully will continue to do so. With some additional support from ACE as well. In terms of our approach, we pull from 2 areas. We have the opportunity of being able to visit hundreds of schools in terms of kite marks and training, etc. So we get the opportunity to really see what works in terms of a whole school approach to character education. It looks massively different in every school that we go to. So we pull on that practical experience of good practice. But what we also do is we're also very keen to take a research-led approach, and so we pull heavily from the work from the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtue at the University of Birmingham, for instance, which segues us into our first speaker, who's Dr. Tom Harrison from the University of Birmingham. So Tom, if I just hand over to yourself.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. So yeah, I'm a reader at the University of Birmingham. I work in a big centre, big research centre that primarily focuses on character and character education research. I also lead a master's programme on character education. And then in today's kind of capacity, I'm the secretary for the Association for Character Education, one of the founding kind of charity trustees of the organisation. And it's a real privilege and pleasure to be really kind of launching this initiative in Scotland, and it's great to have so many of you joining us today to hear about this training and hopefully go forward to some of the other activities and events that Tom just described. I was involved with the Inspiring Purpose programme almost from the start, working along with the kind of Character Scotland team. I was a trustee for Character Scotland for a while, and I've really watched that programme develop into you know, something really great that I know a lot of students love, and I've looked at a lot of the posters and the from the Inspiring Purpose program, and they're clearly kind of a really enriching program. But what we're hoping to bring here is a kind of a much more whole school approach to character education that kind of starts with that kind of particular program, but looks at how a whole school might kind of approach focusing its education very much on the cultivation of human qualities that we think contribute to young people flourishing. So what do we mean by that? I mean, I'm just really a warm-up act for Gary, who's going to do the bulk of today's training and really talk to you much through the more practical elements of character and character education, what it looks like in school places. But I just want to say a couple of words from the outset on kind of perhaps what is character, why it matters, and a little bit around the call for character in the next few minutes. What is character is a far too big a question for me to deal with in any kind of comprehensive way right now, but for today I think you can take it as the human qualities like courage, honesty, compassion, integrity, resilience, these qualities that make us who we are and contribute to our ability to flourish as individuals. Be successful, be well, be healthy, all the rest of it in our own life, but also contribute more broadly to society as well, make us good, active, kind of contributing citizens. That doesn't mean people who just do what they're told. This is about kind of critical thinkers, autonomous thinkers, people who can challenge norms if need be, but have got character qualities that enable them to do that in a way that really contributes to kind of conversations around citizenship and civics and those sorts of areas. So it's about who we are. Character's about who we are. Its purpose, we think is absolutely, the purpose of education, we think character is absolutely the centre of it. We think actually good education, you can't really distinguish from good character education. The development of these qualities should be part and parcel of what all schools do. They contribute to many what schools do anyway. It's very unlikely you're going to get great attainment, good behaviour, good employability statistics, etc., unless you've got students at your school who've got the sorts of qualities that I mentioned earlier. They're two sides of the same coin in many ways, character and kind of attainment, behaviour, etc. They all contribute together. So we really think it's central to the purpose. One of our concerns in recent years has been through kind of policy initiatives and others that in some cases that character has you may not want to call it character, but the focus on human qualities, traits, dispositions, values, etc., has been squeezed out in some schooling, primarily because of focusing on narrowing of the curriculum in some areas, etc. So we've done quite a lot of kind of policy initiatives, particularly south of the border, around that, and it's how schools can kind of prioritise or put more prominence on character in their schooling. But we do know through the research, and this is the last thing I'll say, I just want to give a kind of an overview around the call for character, but we do know through our research and other people's that people think that character really matters, that they're perhaps squeezing out of a focus on kind of character and kind of human values within education has not been because teachers wanted that to happen. It's anything but. Most teachers I speak to, in fact every teacher I speak to, believes that these qualities are an essential part of education, that yes, we're certainly trying to educate our children to be to develop maths and English and all these other important qualities, but alongside that you're also trying to make them more resilient learners or more kind of courageous kind of people looking at in within school or beyond school, or more kind of compassionate in terms of how they contribute to their kind of friends' lives, but also lives beyond that. So teachers just believe and think character is important. We know that parents do that as well. I've conducted quite a lot of research looking at kind of parents' understandings of character and character education, and we've done quite a lot of surveys that show how much parents prioritise character. I did one recently that we looked at parents and teachers' perception. This was all south of the border. This was all with English schools, but I would expect the same to be true because we've seen studies in America that have similar sorts of findings, and we'd expect them to be true in different sorts of locations. But this found that, you know, both parents and teachers, when pushed, prioritise character over things like attainment. Now, it's a bit of an unfair question because I've just said character and attainment are very much two sides of the same coin, you know, but we said, you know, if you absolutely had to choose between, you know, your children developing kind of these sorts of qualities or passing their GCSE results, and we also asked the question in a number of different ways as well, they put character high up. So parents were prioritising it. Interestingly, in that survey, when we asked them what they thought their counterpart, we asked parents what they thought teachers were prioritising, we asked teachers what they thought the parents were prioritising, they felt the opposite to be true. So we actually found a bit of a communication gap sometimes between parents and teachers about their focus or prioritisation of character over other things like attainment. And students themselves, in fact, some of the best conversations I have when I've got the privilege of going around schools doing focus groups and interviews are with students around this topic. They get it. They get that, you know, who they are, their you know, their qualities is actually essentially going to be what it enables them to kind of lead successful, fulfilling and kind of flourishing lives beyond when they leave schools. So there is a real kind of you know, kind of growing understanding that character matters. As I say, I keep using that word term character. We think it works nicely, and it's used in all sorts of domains to kind of really sum up the sorts of qualities that we think are important, but we understand that schools may not always use that term, which, you know, it doesn't really matter what term you use. It's more about the idea that, you know, the development of human qualities should be part and parcel of educational approach. Gary's going to talk a lot more about how that might be done, what that might actually look like, and some kind of based on some of the research and practice that him and others have actually been involved with. But I'm going to conclude here by just saying, hopefully, that you find these sessions that we're running for you helpful, increase your knowledge, but we would really welcome hearing from you. We think ACE, the Association for Character Education, is a collective venture. It's about members at their kind of grassroots coming together and kind of working with us and furthering the conversation and furthering our understanding. So hopefully what we present, and I know there's going to be plenty of time for a question and answer at the end of this, you can actually kind of tell us about what you're doing in your schooling, in your situation, because we'd love to kind of learn from you as well. So I'm going to hand over to Gary, and I look forward to, I'm not able, unfortunately, to stay for the whole of the session, but I'll be joining some of the others. And we are planning a big event up in Scotland when we're all allowed to see each other again, probably in early 2022, and hopefully we will see many of you at that face to face. So I'm going to leave you now and hand you over to Gary. Thank you.
Right, hi everyone. Hope everything is clear enough there and you managed to see my first slide. Thank you very much, Tom, for the introduction. I want to spend a couple of moments just giving briefly my background and story, I suppose, because it gives an illustration of how I got into character education and the sort of value it is. Well, as the slide suggests, I'm a recently retired executive principal. I ran 3 high schools, secondary schools, 11 to 18 schools in the south of England, and all 3 schools were in serious difficulties. There were schools where behaviour was appalling, attainment was even worse, and parents didn't want to send their children to those schools. And when I took over the first of those schools back in 2000, 2001, and you're faced with a scenario where everything is badly broken in a school, literally at all levels. And when I say a school is badly broken, it is, you know, schools in such a scenario are filthy, the administrative support is awful, there is no culture, nobody knows what the culture is. And when you visit such schools, you see angry children and demoralized staff. So taking over a school such as that, as the principal, you're left with a pretty stark challenge. You either focus on a bit of a veneer, a bit of a sort of papering over the cracks. There's a lot of pressure, as Tom Harrison suggested, on the metrics of delivering examination success. But I decided that the only way I was going to be successful as a principal and take the schools forward was to be honest to what I considered the most important thing. And being a father of 3, my wife and I only ever wanted our children to flourish, to be happy. And it seemed to me very sensible that that's what I should want for the children that were my responsibility. So I was lucky that I had trustees at the school who were, these were state schools, who were very supportive of the fact that they were prepared to build a set of values that would be sustainable from when I had left, and that would allow the school and the parents and the local community to be crystal clear about what the school was about. So that was my background. We're working with schools that were very badly broken and using character education to transform what was going on, particularly to transform behaviours and attitudes. And that's probably where character education has its biggest impact. And certainly at something like 254 schools that I've visited over the last 3 years, all of them have outstanding behaviour, no matter what their context, whether they are in one of the most deprived areas in an inner city, or they're in rural leafy countryside, or they're a private school, it doesn't matter. They all have outstanding attitudes to behaviour, and more on that a little bit later on. As Tom suggested, the link between strong character education and academic attainment is slightly more tenuous, but I think all of us who are teachers of any experience will believe that children who are self-motivated, take responsibility for themselves, are likely to be better learners. And I'm glad to say that when I took over those schools and started launching character education, I didn't actually call it character education at the time, I started to research and see, what actually is the backdrop of the values that I wanted to instigate and instill in my schools. And I started to work with the Birmingham Centre, the Birmingham University, the Jubilee Centre. I started to work with some other lead advisors in the UK government around character and character education, but particularly with a focus on improving attitudes to learning and behaviours. Okay, so let's just move on the slide, make sure I'm on the right one. Okay, so just as Thomas suggested, if you haven't managed to have a look at the Jubilee Centre at Birmingham University, please do. It's a centre with some outstanding resources, all of them free. Some really excellent training resources available as well. I recently launched, I was part of writing one unit for it, a recently launched teacher CPD program that you can do entirely online. It allows you to have a 360-degree approach as to what character education is in the fullest sense and how it can be used to transform a school. So Jubilee Centre, which is in essence the Association for Character Education, is a branch, even though an independent branch of the Jubilee Centre. And again, just to reiterate what Tom Haig said at the beginning, Association of Character Education, of which I've been the chair since its inception, is really focused on taking the best of national and international research and combining it with practical expertise and excellence. In other words, looking at what really works in schools, using sound, very thorough academic and practical research to make sure that schools can be guided and supported to actually transform what they're doing in terms of making progress. And just, an odd slide to put up. This was when I did a presentation not long before Christmas, I think, in Estonia. And now Estonia has some of the highest academic achievement in Europe, certainly in terms of PISA ranking. The young people in Estonia do really well on academic attainment, maths and literacy and so on. But for the last few years, they've realized that something's wrong, that the metrics of, entirely focusing on the metrics of examination output isn't working, and their children are not particularly happy. Mental health issues were relatively commonplace, and that's a reflection of what's going on in our own society, particularly during COVID, of course. And they are very keen now to move away from an entirely academic focus to look more at developing individuals and understanding, as I was working with Tartu University actually in Estonia, they understood quite clearly that if people were going to flourish, they had to have the strength of character and the skill set of working with other people to actually, to do that, to flourish. You can't do it in isolation. Okay, I thought I'd just stand back and do a little bit of the basics of what character is, and forgive me if any of this is patronizing in any way, but I think sometimes it helps if you're going to be looking at something which I believe can transform the education in any school, but particularly schools that are having some difficulties. And I think it's really worth knowing what we're doing. I've been teaching since 1980, and I've seen enormous changes, particularly in schooling, but particularly in parenting. I think I've seen parents become ever more focused on their children's needs. Yes, they love their children. Sometimes they make the mistake, well, not sometimes, I think far too frequently, they make the mistake that they don't want their child to suffer any upset or mistake, any failure in their lives whatsoever. And they become these, well, I think they're often referred to as tiger parents or tiger mums, whatever you want to call it, where they forbid their child to suffer any degree of hardship or setback. And of course, that can't happen. And I think when we've got such changing society, particularly we look at the way social media has altered things over the last few years in particular. If I look just what's going on in politics today, I mean, you know, the concept of values and virtues, if we're looking certainly what's going on in the UK government at the moment, I think there must be some real concern about putting virtues first and people actually understanding it. And I think when we're looking at that scenario, to be able to go back 2,500 years and look at a set of virtues that actually make sense and are still relevant today, I think is really useful. And Aristotle, some 2,500 years ago, describes moral virtue, well, as what's on the screen there, something that we actually learn through assimilation by what we get from people that model such behaviors, but of course we can be taught it as well. And I think what he wrote nearly 2,500 years ago, that we're anxious to produce citizens that can actually make the right choices by looking at virtues, morality, and working within those virtues. On top of that, stuff that Aristotle wrote so many time ago, various research organizations have done a lot of work into what makes people successful in life. And by successful in life, I mean contented in their personal life, emotionally resilient and emotionally strong, and of course, successful in their professional life as well. And Demos, which is a research organization, a bit of a right-wing organization, did some work many, many moons ago where they actually looked at what made people successful. It was an international study, looked at organizations, recruitment of people and so on. And actually, when it boiled down to what made or enabled people to be successful, it was entirely down to character. And actually, 3 character traits tended to stick out. And these are the 3 that they identified. And I think teachers will recognize these. Self-regulation, this concept of being able to control yourself, self-discipline, take responsibility for your action, understand that actually it is, no matter what, if a child, no matter what their background, no matter what difficulties they have, ultimately they have to be taught to take responsibility for themselves and to control themselves. Empathy, well, we're not islands. We cannot lead others, we cannot work collaboratively, we cannot actually mix within society unless we are empathetic. We must understand how other people are feeling. The ability to put yourself in the shoes of others is an absolutely vital character trait. And again, it's assimilated, we get it from people, but it can be taught as well. And, you know, alongside empathy, we've got such things as generosity of spirit, kindness. There's a multitude of words that would describe these virtues, but basically, these are the 3 most important. And the other one, well, it's a word I made up many, many moons ago, stickability. And lots of other words for this. The Americans would call it grit. Resilience is a word that's often used, determination, courage. But stickability, as far as a young person is concerned, and indeed a teacher, and as a principal, as a head teacher, I remember this as well, doing stuff that you don't want to do. You can be bored rigid, but you've got to carry on doing it. You know, carry on going in a lesson scenario where you are failing continuously. Being able to keep on going, sticking at it is a wonderful skill set. You know, being able to prioritize work and not avoiding work just because you can't do it is absolutely crucial. So there's our backdrop. Aristotle set a set of virtues, we'll look at them in a few moments, that are still absolutely relevant today, 2,500 years later. And I think that's quite reassuring when we've got so much in our society that changes at such a rapid pace. And this is, I think, the next building block is to say, okay, well, if we accept that virtue, character is important, what do we want it to look like in schools? And how's it going to manifest itself in a school scenario? Well, I think the first point there is that strong character, and Aristotle was crystal clear about this, this is having the wisdom and the virtue to make the right choice. And if you think about it, that's what we're trying to teach children to do. It's called phronesis, you know, having the wisdom, the common sense to weigh up a scenario and make the right choice. Whether it's just to simply choose to behave in a classroom or to make life, you know, major life decisions decisions when you're mixing or working with somebody, it doesn't matter. The ability to make the right choice is utterly crucial. And good character also facilitates happiness. I mean, I firmly believe this, certainly as a father and a principal. Good character facilitates happiness, this deep sense of flourishing that comes, and it's not just a fleeting thing, that actually causes an inner contentment that actually makes us emotionally resilient and actually able to deal with everything that life is going to throw at us. Because, of course, young people this day and age are going to have to be incredibly flexible, and they're going to have a lot of stuff thrown at them they're going to have to overcome. A guy called Anthony Seldon writes a lot about happiness, and I think I've taken the liberty of distilling it down to a tiny phrase here, is that happiness stroke fulfillment, really, we mustn't mix it up with pleasure. A lot of young people, indeed a lot of adults, think of fulfillment of happiness as pleasure. Pleasure is about personal consumption, doing something for yourself, and by definition, it'll only ever be fleeting. You'll only ever experience pleasure, and it will need topping up. We've all done it, including myself. You buy something, a new car or whatever, it's fun for a couple of weeks, and then you need the next phase. So Anthony Seldon was crystal clear that we can teach children to flourish and to be happy. And he boils it down to two things. And if you're going to be happy, it really does involve two things. It involves your own personal effort, usually over a period of time, and it always involves some degree of generosity of spirit to others. So this idea that it's almost impossible to be happy and truly fulfilled unless you're doing it in conjunction with a generosity, a kindness, an interaction with other people. This idea that if you're going to develop as an individual, develop your character as an individual, it must be within the community that you're working within. And the last couple of points for children, they get this, displaying strong character, and don't misinterpret this, displaying strong character almost inevitably requires some level of personal hardship, some degree of sacrifice. If we're going to overcome something, if we're going to show strong character, it probably means that we're going to be stretching and testing ourselves. I always remember years ago, a young man coming to see me, a bit of a tricky lad. He had lots of issues. Behavior wasn't particularly great. And he said, Mr. Lewis, he said, can I get a stickability award? We used to have rewards for stickability. And he said, look, I spent 4 hours on maths last night. I surely deserve a stickability award. And I said, no, you're not getting it, John. He couldn't believe it. He said, well, that's not fair, sir. I said, well, you love maths. You're brilliant at it. 4 hours of maths is that's of no hardship for you whatsoever. Now, if you'd been and told me that you spent 4 hours on your history essay, and I know you don't like creative writing or factual writing, then that would deserve a stickability. And kids get that. They understand that they have to overcome some degree of difficulty to show strong character. And when the schools are planning their character program that's going to integrate all aspects of the school's DNA, it's as well to remember why we're doing it. It's because we want kids to make the right choice. Ultimately, we want to facilitate and allow them to know how to be happy and fulfilled. And finally, in this section, and always being a principal in schools that had children of all abilities, I do feel that many schools are set up in such a way that we tend to focus on the more able. The academic bias inevitably tends to suit the more able youngsters. And yet many schools, most schools, certainly state schools, there's going to be a complete bell-shaped distribution. My degree's in maths, but a complete bell-shaped distribution of what youngsters are about. So if we've got really weak youngsters, academically that is, they've got to learn that actually strong character can allow them to really gain intrinsic reward from whatever they do. And I always tell a little story. Years ago, I had a lad who wasn't doing very well at school. He went off, he then worked in a shoe shop near London. And I went to the shoe shop, unbeknown to me, he was working there, been there a couple of years. He was delighted to serve me, in fact, desperate to serve me. And he said in the conversation, he said, so I remember what you say about character. He said, I am going to be the best shoe salesman that this shop has ever seen. I'm desperate to be the manager. I work really hard. I just want to be brilliant at what I'm doing. And I think that concept of allowing children to get a real sense of achievement and intrinsic reward from whatever they're doing is actually really, really important. So just look at those virtues. They, I'm not going to spend any particular time on this, but that, 2,500 years these have been around, and they can be categorized into sort of sets of, performance, moral, intellectual, and civic. And on top of all these virtues is this meta virtue of phronesis, this ability to make the right decision. And it involves being able to draw on all of these virtues at some point or another, and with some degree of emphasis. And what Aristotle said about these virtues is that really, if we want somebody, for instance, to show courage, it isn't a digital virtue. There isn't courage and not courage. It's a sort of an analog balance where we want children, anybody, to be courageous. We don't want them to be reckless. We don't want them to take part in activity that's going to put themselves and others at risk. And similarly, we don't want them to be afraid. We don't want them to be risk averse. We want them to be able to push and challenge themselves. So if we take something like courage, it's about that idea of constantly teaching children to weigh up where they are on that seesaw of courage and to be aiming to be working somewhere in the courageous middle. An example that might be, while I was working with a school where they had some high achieving girls, high ability girls who weren't doing very well at all. And they couldn't quite understand why. And, I spent a morning at the school, and it became very obvious to me, particularly observing these girls in class and talking to them afterwards, that these are very able girls that didn't want to make mistakes. They weren't prepared to make mistakes. So in the maths lesson I watched them in, they were doing exercises where really they could get 18, 19 out of 20 without really trying and being sure that they were going to get it. And they'd much rather do an exercise of 20 where they were going to get 19 out of 20 and do it, rather than go up to the next more difficult one where they're only likely to get 3 or 4 out of 20 correct. But of course, they would be making excellent progress. They would be challenging their mathematical understanding and pushing themselves forward. Those are examples. That's a simple situation where courage is required to take a risk, and children can be taught that. Moving up to the next tier. So if we've got a foundation stone of we understand what virtues are, what character traits and strengths of character are, we understand that they can be grouped and put into a main set of sequence of characters that are going to do well, then we've got to look at how schools can integrate character education into all aspects of what they do. And this is a crucial aspect. Out of all the schools that I visited, the very best schools teach character all the time, in the sense that it's integrated through all aspects of the school's provision. And this slide really breaks it down into the 3 key zones where schools have got to think about it. So there's character taught, and this is where, frankly, it's taught within the curriculum. And the very best schools, actually, they do it in maths, they do it in their science lessons, they do it in RE lessons, they do it in personal health lessons. It doesn't matter where, but they teach within that particular subject area character. And there's lots of examples of that, and I'll touch on them very slightly later on. Of course, if you're going to have a school that's going to be really good at teaching character, have a curriculum that is dedicated not just to the highest academic standards, but to actually teaching and developing character, then you need excellent staff training. So these schools invest very heavily in constant staff training, not sort of once every half term or once every year. They talk about a little drip feed of training almost on a weekly basis to develop their confidence, their skills, and perhaps more importantly, commitment. So character taught is the element that develops character within the curriculum. And just one final word on that, rather like we teach any lesson, at least we should do perhaps, if we take a geography lesson or a history lesson, good quality teachers, of course, will scaffold that lesson upwards. They will structure it. They will make sure that they're looking at skill sets that are suitable for the age range and the intellectual maturity of the child, and they will start to structure it up. Taught character must be exactly the same. We must scaffold it upwards. So the sort of work that we do with younger 11, 12-year-olds, 5 or 6-year-olds is going to be different than what we might do with 16 or 17-year-olds. It needs to be scaffolded upwards. So there's one zone that schools may consider. The other one, and this is perhaps by far the most important, is the character court bit. This is the character which you will see when you visit a school. Any of us, and I mean any of us in this meeting today, could go to school, and I guarantee within 5 or 6 minutes, you'll have a really strong feeling about what the culture of the school is, the relative quality of the relationships that go on by, because you will see through the interactions between staff and students, between students, teachers and teachers, it doesn't matter, you will see that the culture is reflected, the character which is being taught is modelled in everyone's behaviour. You can't expect children to learn to apply self-control, to be respectful, to be kind, if they're not taught by kind, respectful teachers. So this whole aspect about modelled character is most important. And quality of relationships don't just evolve automatically. Schools have to purposely develop those relationships. They need to invest in teaching, in teachers, training teachers and support staff that they, well, for instance, how they talk to children, the very best of schools teach high quality communication skills so that they are guaranteeing that children feel respected, listened to, and that the quality of dialogue between teachers and students is going to enhance this modelled character, this sense of I feel safe and I'm in an environment where I feel that I can flourish and I'm going to develop my personal confidence. And finally, the third zone that schools would want to look at is this bit about character sort. If we accept my premise earlier on that children have to test themselves to show character, it doesn't come easy, then we must give them an opportunity to do that, to test themselves, to practice character. They must have the opportunity to develop their character. Now, whether that's working in civic service in some way or another, whether it be in charitable works, whether it be in the sports field, whether it be in arts and the crafts, it doesn't matter. But they must be given the opportunity to collaborate with others, to lead others, and to experience what service means. And then all that idea of determination, keeping on going, this concept that service of doing something you don't really want to do, you know, sending 15-year-old students to work at a local old people's home, for instance. None of them want to do it at the beginning, but if you can actually encourage them, actively encourage them, prod them to do it, they will start developing their character. And if we don't push them, they won't actually develop it. I'm going to say something slightly controversial here, and I've seen it in the very best of schools, and indeed I insisted it in my own schools. I firmly believe that children have to be challenged. I firmly believe that too many parents don't want their child to suffer a mistake and a failure. But unless we learn to deal with failure, unless we learn to deal with mistakes, we cannot make progress. So children must be pushed. And I see too many teachers who are too kind in the wrong way. You know, the sort of teacher where you will go into a lesson and they'll ask a question of a child, and that child will be hesitating and perhaps unclear of the answer. The teacher looks at them, sees their discomfiture, and very quickly either gives them the answer or moves on to somebody else who would know it. That isn't developing character. You know, children need the opportunity to be put on the spot and to test themselves. I've been to schools that were failing very badly, facing closure, and 2 years later they were outstanding. And I can think in one school down in the southwest of England near Bristol, a school that had been struggling very badly for a long time, and they actually forced the children to do such things as stand up and deliver small talks in assembly. They weren't allowed to not stand up in class and answer questions. It's not uncommonplace, but there was a school where children weren't allowed to put their hand up. The teacher had a random generator and questions were allocated to individual children. So this idea that if children are going to get the chance to develop their character, they must have those opportunities. So schools must provide lots of extracurricular opportunities for the collaboration, for leadership, opportunities to serve, so that through that, children practice their character. Just as I was a bit of a sports when I was younger, just the same way as I'd go and play football, the more I trained, the better I got. The better your character gets when you train yourself at it, when you have an opportunity to develop it on a regular basis. So moving on a little bit now, so where some of the definitions come, we can move away from a wider, broader brush description of what character looks like. And these are some of the definitions that I've found around researching. The curriculum that provides wider work to support learners to develop their character, including a resilience, confidence, and independence. Look at those words: resilience, confidence, and independence. this should be the purpose of teaching. This is the purpose of education. I remember as a head teacher seeing teachers being obsessed with the next test they were doing, and how can I get the children in my care to pass this test? And I would observe such lessons, and the teachers would be working incredibly hard, but the children much less so. The children were reaching a rather comfortable scenario where they're saying, well, miss, you go do the work. You're cracking yourself away there. I'll just sit back. I don't know it. I'll put my hand up and you'll give me the answer. You're going to spoon feed me through this examination. You're going to get me a good grade. And frankly, I won't have to do a great deal. Now, of course, I'm being flippant to make the point there, but we've got to get children to develop that level of independence, because ultimately the most successful children academically are not going to be the ones that are behaving well in class. It's the ones that when they go home in the evening have that character that's going to allow them to show resilience and stickability, to sit and revise, to sit and do that extra research. That is going to be much more important than them actually being taught well in class, although of course high quality teaching is necessary. I think these two summaries, I just love these definitions. I think if a school is trying to do this, they're in the right direction. They're not only ensuring that their children are enjoying what they do at their school, which is of course basically 10% of their whole life, but you're also preparing them properly for what they're facing in the future. It is our duty as teachers to ensure that is the case. Now, if a school was going to embark on wishing to have a character program, obviously I think they've got to look at those elements that I've just discussed earlier on to see which is going to be important to them. But like any new initiative, it can't be some sort of bolt-on. I have visited schools where the principal says, oh, well, I think character is quite a good idea, but it's not my thing. Here's my person who leads on character. And then I know when I see that, but what I'm going to see is probably some nice activities. It's a little tacked on thing to the side, but it isn't going to transform the school. It's not going to transform the experience of the young people or indeed the teachers in that school. So there are 6 benchmarks here that I think I'm only going to flick through them very quickly, but these are the sorts of things that if I was starting up now thinking, where are we in developing the character of our children, then I think I'd want to just look at these. Firstly, decide what kind of school are we? Have we got a very clear ethos? Have we got a culture that everybody knows? I've been to so many schools where they claim that to be the case, but it's not entirely true. When you speak to children, you speak to students, you speak to parents, teachers, non-teaching staff, they're not entirely clear about what the culture is. And I think the very best leaders in school understand that culture is something that ethos is the set of values, culture is the practice of those values, the behaviors in a school that happen automatically. When you go to the very best of schools where children are contented, staff love working there and work incredibly hard because they feel valued and they're able to work autonomously, it's because there is this focus on understanding that the value of the individual comes first. So we've got to look at that. So what kind of school are we, and the culture reflecting that? What are our expectations of behavior towards each other? Again, this is about schools of character are not fluffy places. They are places where they have, for instance, incredibly well-defined behavior systems where expectations of behavior are absolutely crystal clear, but there's a real love and a compassion about how those parameters of behavior are promoted and transmitted to the young people. It's not authoritarian, it's not sanctions driven, it's about getting children to make the right choices. So expectations of behavior. How well does our curriculum? So this is the teaching bit. We can't expect it to be just via assimilation. We can't just have nice model behavior. We've got to teach children about character and what comes with it. And there is a word there, or 2 words, which I'm afraid I feel very strongly about: cultural capital. I've spent 20 years as a principal and more years before that as a teacher of science and maths, and I've taught in all sorts of schools, from some of the best public schools in the land to some of the most deprived. And I've seen children in all sorts of schools, very, very bright. And when I've worked when I've been to some of the best private schools, I don't see children that are any brighter. I don't see children that are more capable. I see children that are frequently more confident and have much, much greater access to cultural capital. This idea that children learn how to speak correctly. I don't talk about accent, I'm talking about a vocabulary to articulate their feelings, to understand that to get on in life, we have to understand the currency, the cultural currency that allows us to do it. And I think schools have got to be honest about themselves. They've got to ensure that they are providing opportunities to develop that cultural capital. Otherwise, particularly youngsters from disadvantaged backgrounds will always lose out. And it's most important that we work on that. That's a separate unit altogether, really. How good is our co-curriculum or extracurricular provision? The very best of schools, of course, will promote ample opportunity to work in teams, collaboratively, to lead teams. It doesn't matter what it is. And certainly the one thing that is true about character education, it has to be done within the context of the school and the community it serves. It has to be. What is right for a school in a Manchester or Glasgow isn't going to be the same as a school in a rural area. There'll be lots of real similarities, but there'll be some differences. And a school has to look at its own context and say, well, what are the values that are so important to us? What do we hold dear? Because if we don't hold those values dear as teachers, as leaders, then we can't be passionate about leading on them. We can't be passionate about transmitting them to the people and the young people in our care and transmitting it to parents. Volunteering, vital aspect about character. I said about you can't do it in isolation. Sorry, I'm just flipping through these, a little bit conscious of time. I'm just trying to give an overview. But these are the sort of 6 pillars I would suggest where schools might want to say, well, looking at those zones, where do we fit? Where are we on that journey? If we're going to be a school of character, we're going to have to need some short-term plans, some medium-term and some longer-term plans looking at those zones about where we think we're going to be. And finally, last 5 minutes or so, just check the time, yes, last 10 minutes or so, just some feedback from what I have learned and been privileged to learn from visiting so many schools and from when I was a leader and a DFE, a government advisor at the same time. Visiting schools is the most wonderful way to have access to excellent practice. And if I could go back now, I would ensure that when I was starting as a principal at school, I would ensure that each teacher had the opportunity to visit at least 4 or 5 other schools in fairly rapid succession. We learned so much from the high quality work that's going on in all schools. And I've been to some schools where pretty well what they're doing isn't very good at all, and the school is struggling, but they're always doing something that is wonderful, and it's a real gem. And it's nice to be able to focus positively on what they do really well. So here's just a few slides summarizing what we've seen, what the Jubilee's seen, and I've distilled it rather simplistically because it's much more complex than that. I'm going to start off with what we saw which didn't work, things that weren't going well. And just very quickly, and forgive me for doing it in a fairly crude summary, but it's just to make a point. But these are the common themes that we tended to see of schools that were really struggling, or this is where they were before they decided to transform themselves via a focus on values-led character curriculum and character program. Weak and effective leadership characterized by manipulation and fear. That doesn't work. It may work in the short term. You can get people to do something through fear, but not for very long. People have to feel that they're valued. They have to feel that they are working with a degree of autonomy. So there's got to be a real sense of trust, proper delegation, but we can't force people to fear. Punitive actions dominate. These are sort of schools where I've been in, and it's behavior is very sanctions driven. Blame culture is utterly rife. So everybody's scoring points on everybody else. There's a focus on procedures and actions rather than fundamental values. So these are schools where it becomes a real objective to fill in a piece of paper or complete a set of reports, when actually there is an indifferent focus on such things as communication, relationships, and the quality of what we're doing elsewhere in the school. These schools will become inspection or performance driven. I mean, examinations are important, please don't get me wrong, and certainly as a principal, I always wanted the highest possible examination success, but not by sacrificing everything else. But it is easy because it's an easy measure. Measuring performance, examination performance is straightforward, and people can be held to account. These schools often claimed that they had a clear ethos and culture. I would disagree. Aggression, conflict, and negativity dominate relationships. These will be where you walk around the school, there's a sense of tension, morning break or non-class times, you see children in groups, they'd be angry, shoulders sort of squared up. Teachers were avoiding particular groups of children, or if they did interact with them, it would be all sorts of pointing hands, aggressive body language. You see it all the time. And in those situations, nothing works. Attainment is awful. Staff and students are not enjoying things. Well-being and contentedness is way out of the picture and is not seen as a priority. The opposite is true. Where you've got schools that have transformed themselves, and I've seen this, and it's wonderful to know that you can take schools that look as if they're going to, literally their only option is to close because they're so poor. But if there is a focus on, let's build up from these foundation stones of character and value, and we bring everybody with us and make sure everybody understands that this is what we're putting first and foremost, then the transformation can be incredibly rapid indeed. But putting others first, a focus on strengths. So these are situations where the staff work really hard, but if they're not good at something, they have got the courage to ask for help. They're not worried about being judged in any way. The leadership is saying, well, look, that's not going quite so well. So what can we do to train you better? We'll get you working with Jen and, with Jenny over there, because she's really good at working with 14-year-old boys who are really struggling, or you're not really good at structuring. We'll get you working with somebody else. And there's a real sense of, we'll just collaborate and work together rather than focusing on the negativity. Now, of course, these aren't weak schools. Ultimately, if a teacher is struggling and he gets that, or he or she gets that level of support, then of course, if they're not good enough, they're not good enough. But there's a long journey to go before that. Trust, absolutely important. It takes ages to build trust and seconds to lose it. And I've seen too many teachers forget that. Sincerity and authenticity, you can't say one thing and do another. I've seen leaders that claim that they run by, virtue is the most important thing, and the next minute they're changing examination syllabus just purely because they might get an extra 2%. That's hardly sincere and it's hardly authentic. And these last 2 points are the most important. In these successful schools, openness and vulnerability of leaders at all levels is utterly crucial. Leaders are so confident, they don't have to be brilliant at everything. They don't have to be principals and vice principals or senior middle leaders that can do everything. They understand that they are just there to facilitate the work of others, and they're open and they're vulnerable about what they can't do well. And it just creates a sense of mutual trust, an openness that allows everybody to work with a real sense of, well, we're in this together, and what I do is valued and is going to take the school forward. And finally, but the most important, outstanding communication skills. Schools that do not allow character to flourish because they do not facilitate outstanding communication. That's both particularly orally, but not just orally, written communication as well. How do we communicate to each other? How do we communicate to our local community, particularly parents, of course, is the most important things. And if I go to schools and they're not teaching how to communicate carefully and skillfully and structuring it, I know that there's some real work to do. I'm just going to flick through some of these. Some of these are really, I think they're most important. As I said before, schools of character are outstanding, always have outstanding behaviour, and it's because the children choose to behave really well, not because they're forced to behave well. One of my specialities was going to schools where the behaviour was appalling, and the first thing I do is I'd speak to 200 youngsters in the morning. I'd try and speak to as many teachers as possible, and always teachers came up with the same things. Oh, the senior leadership at the school they're not strong enough. They're not around enough. We used to have 2-hour detentions. We only have 1 hour now. If we went back to 2-hour detentions, it'd be much better. The children are rude. I shouldn't have to put up with children being rude to me. And it's all about sanctions, and they've got to behave in a certain way without actually going back to the fundamental things, which is we've got to teach children that they are respected, that the quality of communication that goes on between the member of staff and the child is utterly vital to take things forward. Then we've got a chance of actually children choosing to behave well. I remember when I had a head teacher of a boys' school came to visit me, and he was trying to work on character. He'd taken over a school that had appalling behavior, even worse achievement. And he'd made some really good progress. And over about 9 months, He'd had a very, very sanctions-driven behaviour policy. And it was working, but only up to a point. And he came to see me and he spent a day with me, him and some of his other senior leaders. And I always remember a comment he said at lunchtime, and it taken me 8 years to get at the school where I didn't have to have any supervision at lunchtime, where the children, and there were 1,200 of them, would go in at lunch, would go to the hot meal or the salad bar or the sandwich bar or pizzas or whatever it is, would sit down over here, socialize over here without supervision. It took 8 years to get to that point. And he looked in awe and he said, you know, my school works like this, but only because we've got 20 teachers supervising, and it's got this spotlight of supervision on those children all the time. As soon as the spotlight moves off, they're going to behave well. They're going to behave badly, should I say. Whereas here, the children choose to behave well. And of course, it then becomes practice. It then becomes part of the culture of the school. And then, you know, and children don't even think about it. It just becomes literally a routine of behavior. So I think in schools of character, that is something that is very important. And student voice is significant. Yes, it's important that schools have school councils and things such as that. But I think quite often schools forget that the most significant part of student voice is simply listening to the children on a daily basis. You know, I used to consider an absolute privilege as a principal to walk around, meet as many kids as I could at break time, sit and have lunch with them. And, you know, if you can talk to 50 or 60 youngsters a day, even if it's only 2 or 3 sentences, they will tell you how they're feeling, what's going well and what isn't going well. That is real student voice. And if a school is going to take things forward, it needs to listen to its clients on a regular basis. And I see too many schools where they don't do that. They might have every now and then a thing where they'll bring 1 or 2 children and listen to it. But this is something you've got to tap into literally on a daily basis so that children feel as if they're having an input into what things happen. I'm going to skip through these in a moment. I'm just going to finish up with this. Literally, there's a lot more, but I'm going to finish up with this. Seems an odd slide. You know, parenting styles. Well, I said when I first started as a head teacher, as a principal in a badly broken school, what was I going to do? Well, I come from a working class background, well, skilled working class, I suppose you call my father and my mother. My mother was from Ireland, left school at 13, semi-literate, but worked hard all her life and achieved quite well. And I thought, well, I don't know what I'm going to do running this school, but I'm just going to do what my parents did. And what were my parents? Well, over the years, I've looked at the research and so on, and I'm going to finish up with this. Parents, there's huge amounts of research out there, but really parenting fits into 4 main areas: permissive, authoritative, hands-off, and authoritarian. And the reason I'm spending some time on this, because really that's what schools do as well. There's permissive, authoritative, hands-off, and authoritarian. You know, the authoritarian parent is the more traditional one. Yeah, you'll go to bed at 7:30, you'll do what I say because I say that's what you're going to do. And such children will do quite well. At the beginning, they do quite well. They have a routine. They go to bed at 7:30 because they're told to, but there's not much explanation, not necessarily, they don't really know why they're doing it. And unfortunately, the research has shown that such children in those sorts of parental backgrounds, by the time they reach 13 or 14, are beginning to struggle because they don't know why they're behaving that particular way, because it hasn't really been explained off to. Hands off, well, not a parenting like that. And I suspect my own was when I was very busy. These are the sort of parents who are very busy in their own lives that, you know, they pretty well allow their children to get on with it themselves. You know, I can remember coming home and my son or daughter say, "Dad, can you help me with my maths?" Be 8 or 9 o'clock at night and be absolutely exhausted. And I would say something like, "You know what, son? That's not my homework. I've done that before. This is your homework. I think you should work on it on your own." And he would drift off and, you know, do his maths or whatever. And really, it was because I didn't want to spend the time with him, couldn't be bothered. And that's a hands-off approach. Funny enough, it does work because it does, to some extent, because it does develop independence in young people. Permissive is well, as the name suggests, you know, pretty allow children to do what they want, very little way in parameters set up, very little in the way of expectations. And I'm afraid universally that doesn't work. Yes, it can work in certain areas. It can be in elements of creativity that flourish, but not much else. And by far the most effective type of parenting is authoritative. This, and 50 years of research has shown that these are parents who are crystal clear about describing the parameters of behavior, expectations, values that they and their family hold dear, and they stick to those values, they stick to those parameters, but they constantly explain why. They do it through love, they do it through constant interaction, constant communication, and the child then understands that they just can't do what they want. There is a set of parameters they've got to follow, and there's going to be a set of consequences if they don't work within those parameters, but they know why they're doing it, and they know why they're doing it from a very early age. And I think schools of character would just do well to remember that really what we're doing is reflecting parenting styles. And I think I have taken the liberty of summarizing literally many, I think probably hundreds of thousands of hours of research into parenting into one slide here. But I think it's quite useful to finish on that note, to realize that when we're setting up schools of character, we are actually working almost as we're trying to be outstanding parents. Tom, I'd like to finish there for the moment. I think that's about, just slightly over time, actually. And I think you're going to now allow some feedback, some questions or whatever. And forgive me for rattling on, everybody, but hopefully I've just given you a flavour of what schools of character are about and what's going on practically. Obviously, I've just touched on one or two zones without going into the detail, of which there is ample, I've got, so much evidence and so much exemplars of it that we can look at those at any time. Tom, over to you.
Lovely, thank you very much, Gary. If I could just ask you if you wouldn't mind just stopping sharing your screen, and then we can wrap up with any final questions if there are any. Please pop them into the chat if you do. There was one that came through directly to myself, which was someone did ask about the slides. So before I forget, yes, we'll share the slides from the presentation today afterwards, no problem. Somebody did ask around in your experience in terms of supporting schools who are starting on their character journey, what are some of the biggest challenges that they experience at the start?
I think it's this concept of having a pretty clear direction of where you're going. You can't start without having a shared set of values. A school does not exist until it's got a clear ethos and a culture that actually practices that ethos. So rather crudely and simplistically, ethos are the values for the school. So if you were to go into, if you were to go into a religious school, for instance, whether it be, it doesn't matter, any religious school, they will have a clear ethos. It doesn't matter whether you agree with it or not, and people buy into it. The staff buy into it, the students buy into it, and indeed, of course, the parents buy into it. And it doesn't need much in the way of explanation. So they've got those schools have got a bit of an advantage because they have a set of shared values. Not everybody follows those values. Not everybody will be practicing those values, but they are at least associated with it. So I think if we take that, if you're going to start your journey, you have to be crystal clear. What are the values we hold most dear? What are the character traits we hold most dear for our school and our immediate community? What are the things that are going to be the most important? And that needs to be a bit of a shared piece of work, so the schools that are going to embark on this, they say, right, let's sit down and thrash out what is the most important thing. Why are we here? What is it that we think is the most important thing for our school? And I would advise, evidence has shown that it's very easy to come up with 15, 20 sets of values and character traits. Experience has shown, and I wouldn't say you must do this, but experience has shown that it's best to stick to 3 zones or sets of values. And if those 3 values reflect the ones that I think are the most important, that sense of self-regulation, empathy, and some sort of resilience, stickability, determination, so on. If we have those values circulating within the context of the school and its community, that's an excellent start. That's you have to do that, to be honest with you.
Lovely, thank you. I did have another question around concerns from colleagues around very, very busy time, particularly at the moment for schools. Introducing a character-based program on top of everything that else is going on might bring about a bit of resistance, a bit of kickback, and any advice and guidance on how to respond to that.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's an outstanding question. And I think the reality is you should be able to have character integrated within the school by actually reducing work. Now, you may have to do a little bit extra in the beginning, but it should very quickly die off. So I'll give an example. again, another school down in Bristol, a school that was really struggling, a school whose academic achievement was incredibly low. There was a new principal, a female principal, quite an introverted character, not perhaps your normal kind of principal or head teacher, but she did a bit of evaluation and worked out that the school wasn't making any progress because levels of literacy were so low. The levels of vocabulary and literacy was absolutely appalling. But she said, well, I want to improve that, but I want to do it through values and character because I think that's so important. And so what she did is she doubled up on it. So she decided that every morning the tutor that worked with a particular form group, it was 11 to 16 school, they would read together. So each form had a book, each child had the same book, and the teacher literally read with them every morning for, I think, half an hour. They read through the book, each had their book in silence, reading through it. The teacher would be narrating it and reading through it. And of course, they chose the books really carefully so that the characters in the books, the teachers were able to stop and reflect on whether it be knightly virtues or any sort of virtue, and it had an outstanding effect. And when I visited the school, I visited at that time, and about 18 months later, I remember speaking to a 13-year-old girl who hadn't ever read really at all. She was now reading 30 or 40 books a day, and she said she'd learned so much character from the characters in the books because the school had very carefully chosen them. Now, all right, that's a little bit of an ad hoc way, but it should be able to be set up that you are improving attitudes and character without doing extra work. In fact, the very best activities will be intertwined with improving teaching and learning, examination performance as well. And one other example on that, a very good one, a school where it was near London actually, where the children weren't doing, the behaviour was great, no real problems, but their academic achievement was very low. And the evaluation of the school, I said, well, look, I can see what's happening here. The teachers are working incredibly hard, and the students are not working anywhere near as hard. The students just sat there, feed me. And then this school decided that for 2 weeks, what they were going to do is both the staff and the students will work on being brave. And I think they called it the 6 Bs. You have to ask a buddy, you have to be brave, you have to look at a book or whatever it was. But the teachers for 2 weeks weren't allowed to give answers in class. They weren't allowed to give answers. The children had to work it out for themselves. Now, ultimately, the staff became very good at directing children, facilitating learning. But within 2 weeks, it changed the culture, and the children became much, much better independent learners. So yes, there was a little bit of hardship for 2 weeks, but character was the theme that allowed much better attitudes to learning. So I think this idea of interweaving it with the normal work of the school or the attempted improvements of the school can be done with a little bit of creativity and a little bit of common sense, really.
Lovely, thanks, Gary. And there was just one final question which I can pick up. I think somebody asked that in terms of the schools here and the teachers and the leaders here today, it's great. It feels like something that the rest of their whole school staff team would benefit from knowing more about in terms of helping get started on their character journey. And is there anything out there that could help with this? It's probably worth pointing you towards the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtue that Dr. Tom Harrison works at, who spoke a little bit earlier on. They've developed a fantastic, and it's all free, online CPD course, which is very flexible. You can drop in and out of the different modules, and it fuses together research and best practice, and starts off with the philosophy and the underpinnings of what good character is about, and then how to develop within.
And also, Tom, they have huge quantities of real world resources as well. So, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I very much listened to the colleague that said, well, we're working flat out. How can we do something extra? Well, you can't. In fact, we need to be, certainly leaders in education need to be more focused on the well-being of the teachers so that they have more time to enjoy their own lives, because they're actually going to be better teachers as well. We need to get off this vicious circle of work harder, do more, and back into a cycle of actually being able to breathe a little bit better and actually achieve more by doing less. And I think that is entirely possible.
Lovely, thank you. And just before we close off, Gary, is it worth just giving a very brief synopsis about what's going to be covered in the following 3 training sessions that we've got scheduled?
Well, basically, I mean, obviously, what I've tried to do is an overview here, and an overview is only as good as the examples that you can give, because, you know, when I'm talking about character taught and character sought, and then real examples from real schools, what we will look at then is those real examples within the context that works. So, you know, I will look at how character can be integrated into the curriculum, literally through real world examples, and looking at how schools don't do loads of extra work, but are able to actually really develop and structure a character program in a fairly easy way as well. And I'll be doing that. So one on curriculum, big one on communication. That's absolutely vital. Communication and behavior. So literally looking fundamentally at how communication happens in schools, happens in life. It isn't patronizing. I can say that with a degree of confidence, because all schools that I've delivered it to have thoroughly enjoyed that and found it one of the more useful aspects. And then there is another bit about overall leadership, and that's about structuring a character program. So it's looking at what we did today, which is the foundation stones, and saying, right now, how do we do that evaluation? How do we plot our journey in those three zones, in the curriculum taught, within the modeled behaviors, and in the opportunity for children to develop their character. So we're looking at possible planning, possible leadership of those areas. And of course, when I mean leadership, that can be anybody who's leading a character program or wanting to develop a character program.
Lovely, thank you. I mean, it's worth saying that in terms of ACE and our mission, we're basically here to support schools on their journey and developing character in young people, and embedding it and integrating it into the very DNA of the school is a journey, and schools are at different parts and different milestones on that process, and we're here to kind of support schools wherever they are. So if outside of these training sessions, everyone's got my email, please drop me a line. I'm happy to set up a quick conversation if you've got anything specific that you want to talk through. That's no problem at all. And then we've got the future sessions already scheduled in. Apologies for those who've had to dial in using a phone, because I understand there are some local authorities in Scotland that don't allow you access to Zoom on your work laptops. So we will look to try and facilitate future ones, maybe on Teams or something like that as well, particularly when we do breakout sessions, because we are keen to support you to connect with other schools in your area and across Scotland as well as part of this programme. Any final words from yourself, Gary, before we close off?
No, not really, although it would be nice if you can get feedback, Tom. I mean, I like this idea of a sort of a 3/4 of an hour presentation and then a much more interactive question and answer session where people can, as it were, use me as a facility rather than me just expounding and saying, look, this is a way to do it or whatever, because of course there is no right way, there is no particular way, there's some examples, but people ultimately have to make their own choice. So I would suggest that the future formats will be something along these lines, 3/4 of an hour or so from me on those zones that I've spoken about, and then give colleagues the opportunity to get into a proper, interactive chat about how that's going to look in their own particular context and so on.
Lovely, thank you very much. Okay, brilliant. Well, that's it. That's the end of this session. Thank you very much for everyone attending. I hope that you'll continue with us on this journey of becoming a Scottish School of Character and Values, and we look forward to seeing you in the future.
Yes, good luck, everyone. Good luck.